Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and today I'm going to be showing you how to build this sticky notes application using HTML, CSS, and of course everybody's favorite language, JavaScript. Alright, so this right here is going to be the finished product. As we can see, we've got a bunch of sticky notes on this board. Now, I can do many things such as add a new note by pressing on this big plus icon, and I can say something like this is a new note. All right, so now if I was to click out of this, it's going to save that note and the rest of them to the local storage on the user's browser. So that means if I was to refresh here, all of the notes are going to be retained because they're going to be saved locally on the user's machine within their browser. All right, so I can also do things such as update a note. For example, I can say learn an outside hobby such as mowing the lawn. Okay. Now, of course, that's going to save once again, and I can also delete notes by double clicking and pressing OK. So this project right here is perfect for you guys who are learning JavaScript. Maybe you want to refine your skills, learn something new. This project right here should hopefully help you out. Now, all of the source code for this is going to be linked down below if you want to download it and follow along while you watch today's video. So now, going inside this tab right here, we're going to be beginning from scratch to create what I just showed you. All right, so now going inside the text editor, I've got this empty index.html file. Okay, so the first step here is going to be to make a new directory on the left side here called src, short for source. And inside here, we're going to have a couple of files. Okay, so going inside here, let's make a new file called main.css. This one here is going to contain all of the CSS we need for the sticky note application. And next up, we've got a second file called main.js, and you may have guessed already, this one here is going to contain all of the JavaScript for the sticky notes application. All right, so going back in the index.html, let's link up these two files by going inside the head and dropping down and making a new link to a CSS file going to src/main.css. We can do the exact same thing for the JavaScript right down here. We can say script source, then of course going to src/main.js. Now, it's super important that you include a defer attribute here. This is basically just going to make it so the JavaScript file is going to load up as the web page loads, but it's going to execute only once the document object model or all of your HTML has been loaded inside the JavaScript. Okay, so this right here is going to prevent errors with undefined elements and things like that. All right, so now I'm going to be showing you the HTML and the CSS first, before moving on to the JavaScript. All right, so going down inside the HTML, we're going to need a main container for the entire sticky note application. So dropping down here, let's make a new div with an ID of app. Okay, so now this is just going to be the main container for everything inside the sticky note board. All right, so inside here, let's place an example sticky note. We can say text area. And now we can remove all of these attributes and simply replace it with a class of note. Okay, so this is simply a sticky note. It's nothing more fancy than a text area. All right, so dropping inside the text area, we can add some sample text just to see what it looks like, in the CSS. Okay, so now let's add a button right below here, and this button is gonna be the add new note button. So dropping down here, let's give this a type of button. We're gonna also give it a class here of add-note. All right, so now inside the button text, let's simply put a plus sign. If I save this here and go inside the browser, we're going to get something like this. Okay, so now let's use some CSS to style up what I just wrote in the HTML. All right, so when it comes to the CSS, we're going to go inside the main.css file and we're going to be targeting the body. So for this, I just want to remove some of the default space which the browser puts in there. So we can say a margin of 0 and a background of a green. So I'm going to say #009578. That is the dcode green color. and we're basically done with the body. So moving on to the app ID. For this one here, it's gonna contain a display property. So we're gonna say a display of grid. So we're gonna be using CSS3 grid to place and position all of the sticky notes. Now, this is not gonna be complicated. We're gonna simply say right down below, grid template columns, and this is basically defining how the columns for our grid are gonna be positioned. Okay, so in the case of our sticky note board, we simply just want a bunch of little squares to appear across the page. So we're going to give this a repeat value here of auto-fill and then 200 pixels. So basically this right here just says it's going to display every single sticky note at 200 pixels of width. And if the browser is too small, it's going to simply drop them down to the next line. Okay, so that right there is going to allow us to, of course, position our sticky notes. Next up, we can give this a padding of 24 pixels. This right here is going to be basically just details the padding along the edges of our container and a gap of 24 px between every single sticky note. If I save this here and go back in the browser, we're going to get something like this. As we can see, we have our 24 pixels of space in the top and then this top note right up here, as well as between every single, note, or in this case here, it's going to be the add button. Now, if I was to duplicate a couple of text areas here and make multiple notes and go back in the browser, we get something like this. So that's working perfectly fine. All right, so next up, in terms of the CSS, we're going to be targeting the class of note. So when it comes to a note itself, we're going to be giving this a height of 200 px, the same value as the width we gave inside the grid. So make sure they are the same to give you perfectly square sticky notes. We can also give this a box sizing of border box and a padding of 16 px. Now, of course, this border box means that the padding will not increase the width and height of the sticky note. We can also say a border of none, a border radius of, let's just do something like 10 pixels, okay, as well as a box shadow here of 0, 0, 7 px, then RGBA 0, 0, 0, and then 0.15 to give us a 15% opaque box shadow. I'm going to save this here and go back in the browser and we get something like this. So now let's apply a couple more styles to the note class, namely a resize of none, to remove that default resizable box there. We can just place that right down here, as well as a font family of something like sans serif. You can of course pick whatever font you want, as well as a font size of 16 px inside here. I'm going to save this and go back in the browser and we get something like this. So now we are done with styling up the note class. We can now move on to the add-note class for that big add note button. So for this one, we're going to give this a similar height of 200 px, a border of none, and an outline of none. We can also apply a background here of RGBA, then 0, 0, 0, and then 0.1 for a 10% opaque background. This right here is going to allow the background color of the whole page to seep through the button. Okay, so if I save this and go back in the browser, we get something like this. As we can see, it's a dark shade of green. We can move on by giving this a border dash radius here of something like 10 pixels, the same as our notes from right above, as well as a font size of 120 pixels. This value here might change depending on your font family. We can also give this a text color of RGBA 0, 0, 0, and then 0.5 for a 50% opaque black, as well as a cursor of pointer. So now going back in the browser, we get something like this. So now I want to add a simple hover effect when the user hovers over the add note button. So going back inside here, we can just copy the class name and we can say :hover. And for this one, we can just simply darken up the background color. We can say background at RGBA, then 000. Let's make this 0.2. Okay, so I'm going to also just include a transition here. So if I just say transition on the add note class and I say background at 0.2 seconds, it's going to give a smooth fade between our two different background color levels. If I save this and go back in the browser and hover over, we get that nice transition right there. Okay, so now we are done with the CSS. We can officially move on to the most important part, the JavaScript. Okay, so now when it comes to the JavaScript, well, if we go inside the main.js file, I want to begin by simply declaring every single function we're going to need for this to work. Okay, so we're not going to be writing out the code for each function initially, just actually declaring them and making them usable. Okay, so inside here, we can have a new function called getNotes. So this one here is going to simply retrieve all of the existing notes from our local storage in the client's browser. Next up, we've got the function called saveNotes, and this one here is going to take in an array of notes, and this one is going to simply save the new notes to the local storage on the client's browser. Next up, we've got a function called createNoteElement, and this one here, as the name suggests, it's going to allow us to build a new element to represent a note. And when I say element, I'm referring to an HTML element. Okay, so inside here, we can provide an ID and the note's content. Okay. Next up, we can add a new function called addNote, and this one here, once again, as the name suggests, it's going to be adding a new note, not only to the HTML, but also it's going to save it to the local storage. That brings us to the next function here called updateNote, and this one here, of course, is going to be updating your note instead of adding a new one. It's going to be provided with an ID and the new content for the note with that ID. Now also keep in mind that when I say ID, an ID is simply just a unique identifier for every single note you're going to store. And lastly, we can have a function called deleteNote, and this one here is going to simply take in an ID as well as the HTML element which represents that particular note. Okay, so now I want to stop right here and I'm going to be showing you guys what the data looks like for these sticky notes. Okay, so going back inside my example, if I go inside the DevTools right here and I go to the application section and go down to local storage, as we can see here, I've got a key called sticky notes-notes, and it has a value here of some JSON. So if you're not too sure what local storage is, basically it allows you to store data in key value pairs as strings. Okay, so of course, as JSON is a string, it's going to allow you to store that data as JSON. So if we inspect this JSON array, I've got my 4 notes right down here. Each note has an ID and the content, which correlates to what I showed you earlier inside the createNoteElement function. And that's basically it. So we have all of these notes right here, and we can basically begin the code by implementing that getNotes function, which of course is going to be calling the local storage API. All right, but first, before we do that, I just want to declare a couple of things above all of these functions here. So firstly, I want to get a reference to the main application container. So we're going to say right up here, const notes container is equal to document.getElement by ID, then pass through here the ID of app. So now, of course, notes container refers to this div right here. It's also worth, at this point in time, removing all of the existing text areas because, of course, all of those notes right there is going to be generated using the JavaScript instead. Okay, so going back inside the main.js file, we're going to also get a reference to the button to add a new note. So right here, we can say const add note button. equal to, then say notes container dot query selector. We're going to be getting the first element with a class of add-note inside the notes container. So basically, this is just simply referring to our button to add a new note. Very straightforward. Okay, so now let's begin by coding up this getNotes function. So when it comes to this getNotes function, it's important that it returns an array of notes. Okay, so this is basically just a JavaScript array full of JavaScript objects. Okay, so right inside here, we can return and we'll just say json.parse, and then we're going to pass through here local storage.getItem, then pass through here sticky notes dash notes. Then we can just say or, then pass through here an empty array as a string. So basically, this right here is going to attempt to get all of the notes stored inside local storage. If it's the first time your user is loading up your application, it's going to say or, then default to an empty array. Then of course it's going to say json.parse to convert that JSON string into a native JavaScript array, and you have your list of notes. Okay, so if I was to go inside the browser right here and I call the getNotes function, we get an empty array. Okay, but if I go inside the application tab right up here and I manually add a new key called sticky notes dash notes and have a value of something like a new JSON array, and I say an ID of something like 1 and the content to be something like a new note, something like that. Okay, if I add something like this, then go back into the console and I refresh the page and I call the getNotes function again, we're going to see here we get the note right there. It's also worth noting that you don't need to refresh the page. I don't know why I did that, but you get the point. Your notes are going to be loaded right there. That's working perfectly fine. We can now move on to the next function. It's going to be to save those notes. So basically, it's going to be the function which populates this local storage field with some data. So inside here, we can say local storage.setItem. We're going to be setting the item or setting the notes to the key called sticky notes, of course, dash notes, using the exact same key as we did right up here. And for the value, it's going to be json.stringify and then pass through here the list of notes just like that. So now it's going to take in your JavaScript array of notes and of course stringify it as JSON before it saves it to your local storage key. So the way it's going to work is basically in the case of something like the add note function, this right here is going to get all of the notes that exist currently inside the local storage. Then it's going to add your new note object to that existing array, and then it's going to resave that array to local storage using the save notes function right there. Okay, so let's test this out real quick by going inside the browser. We're going to be calling the save notes function, and then I'm going to pass through here an example array of a singular note. So something like, we can just say an ID of 2 and the content of, let's just put something like a balloon. Okay, I press enter right inside here. Then I call the getNotes function, and it's going to return here an empty, or not an empty, an object right there of your note. So that is how the getNotes and the save notes functions are going to work. All right, so now we can move on to the function called createNoteElement. Okay, so when it comes to this createNoteElement function, basically it's going to have the responsibility of creating a new text area to represent a single sticky note. Okay, so we're going to begin by creating a new constant called element equal to document.createElement, and then we're going to pass in here a text area. Okay, so for those of you guys who aren't too aware how this stuff works, basically this element here is a JavaScript representation of an HTML text area. In fact, it's a newly created text area. This is different to the ones up here because these ones here already exist, whereas this one down here is yet to be added to the page. In other words, it's yet to be appended to the DOM. Okay, so we're going to be getting to that part very shortly, but for now, we're going to need to do a couple of things to the element itself. Firstly, we're going to add a class. So we'll say elements.classList.add, and we can add the class of note. That way, the CSS rules we put right inside here are going to be applied to our notes. We can also say element.value is going to be equal to the content which we pass in, because as we can see, we're able to pass in an ID and some default content for the create notes element function. So it's going to populate that data right there inside the text area's value. And we can also just say elements.placeholder is equal to something like, what's it called? Empty sticky note. There we go. So this right here is simply just a placeholder text when there is nothing inside your sticky note. Okay, so now we have all of these things. We can now simply return that newly created element, but we also need to do a couple of things before we actually return that element. And these involve adding your event listeners to trigger a couple of functions, okay? So firstly, as we know, when the user changes the content of your text area, we're gonna need to save that change or update that note in the local storage. So inside here, we can say element.addEventListener. When the user changes the content of your text area, we're gonna run this function right inside here. So within this function, we're going to simply call the update note function. So inside here, we can pass through the ID, as well as we can just say element.value. So the element.value is going to contain the most recently updated text area content. Okay, so now it's basically just going to hand off the process of updating that note to the update note function. So just for demonstration purposes, I'll say inside the update note function, console.log, then say updating note ... And I'll just also console.log the ID and the new content, okay? So that is the first event listener. Next up, we're gonna need to react to when the user double clicks with the intention of course, deleting your note. So we'll say element.addEventListener. On a double click right inside here, we can run this function. So firstly, we're gonna check if the user actually intended to delete your note. So we'll say inside here, constant do delete equal to confirm. And I'll say something like, are you sure you wish to delete this sticky note? Something like that. So now it's going to prompt the user and ask them this question. If they say okay, then this do delete is going to return, or it's going to contain a true and a false otherwise. Okay, so we can now just simply check right down here. We can say if do delete. So if the user said yes, delete my note, I can then just say delete note. Then the delete note function wants an ID and it wants your element. So I can pass through the element right there, and then dropping down to the delete note function. Let's do the exact same thing with that console log just to test this actually works. So we can just say deleting note just like that. And now I can save this, and we have this create note element function. So now if I go back in the browser and I call create note element, and I pass through something like 5 for the note ID, I then say something like decode for the note's content. I press enter, and we have this text area right inside here. We have that class, the placeholder, etc. So that's working perfectly fine. Okay, so now let's actually make this interesting. So going back inside the text editor, when the page first loads up, we're going to want to get all of our notes and of course display them to the user. So we can say get notes, then we can just say dot for each. So for every single note that currently exists in local storage, we're going to grab onto those notes, or one note at a time right here. So we have a singular note object. Then we can just say something like const note element is equal to, then call upon the create note element function. We're going to pass through here the note ID. We'll say note.id, then we'll say note.content. Remember, these properties here come from the JSON that exists inside your local storage. We can then simply just say notes container dot insert before, and then we'll say right inside here, we're going to be inserting this newly created notes element before the add note button. So we can pass through here the notes element, then pass through the add note button, which just means, like I just said, insert this notes element before our plus sign. Save this and go back in the browser, and we can see we have our balloon from earlier, which currently exists in local storage. So that works right there. If I was to click on the note and I say something like DOM and I click away, we can see the update note function is called. It receives the ID as well as the new content for that note. If I double click and I say no, nothing happens. If I do it again and I say yes, delete the note, we get deleting note right there. This is broken because of course I left this new content down here. So let's just remove that and try it again for example purposes. Double click, press OK. Deleting note for ID number 2. So that is our create note element function right there, as well as our automatic loading of the existing notes on the page. So next up, we can work on the add note function. So when it comes to adding your notes, it's going to be relatively straightforward. The first step is going to be to get a reference to all of the existing notes within local storage. So this right here can be something like const existing notes equal to get notes. So the reason why we need to get all of the existing notes is because we need to basically add a new notes object to this array and then resave the array. Okay, so that being said, let's now say const notes object equal to a new JavaScript object. So now we can generate a new ID. We can say ID equal to math.floor, then say math.random times 100,000, something like that. Then for the default content of a new note, we can just make this an empty string. Okay, so now we have these two constants right here. We can move on to actually creating that note element to represent our new note. So we'll say const notes element equal to create notes element, then of course passing through those ID and the content. So we'll say notes object.id, then note object.content, and similar to the code above, we can actually just copy and paste the insert before on the notes container and put that right down here. So basically just adding our notes element to the page so it's visible to the user. Okay, and then lastly, we can, like I said at the very beginning of this function, we can append our new notes to the array. So we'll say existing notes.push, then we can add the notes object to that array and simply resave it to local storage. Okay, so we'll say save notes, and then we can just pass through here existing notes. Now, the naming of existing notes might be a little bit misleading because of course, once you push a new note, it's now the new notes array and not the existing. So maybe we can make this something like notes, something simple like that. Okay, so now if I save this and go back in the browser, I can now call the add notes function, and I can say nothing actually. I can just press enter and we get this new note right here. If I refresh the page, it's going to stay there because of course it's going to persist to local storage by using this save notes function. So now that brings us to the next step, making that add note button work, this one right here. So for that, if I go right up in the top, I can now just simply say add note button dot add event listener. When the user clicks on that button, let's simply just run the add note function just like this, and that's going to work. If I save this and go back in the browser, then press on add note, nothing happens. I wonder why. Let's try and figure out why. Of course, I was meant to do this parentheses, then I just say add note. So make sure your syntax here for the arrow function is correct. Your parentheses equals, then greater than, then of course your function. Save this, go back in the browser, refresh, and then press the plus button, and our notes are going to be added right there. Refreshing again is going to have those notes persist. So this now brings us to the update note function. So for this one, it's going to work in a similar fashion to the add note function. So here we're going to be once again just grabbing the list of existing notes. So we can just say const, let's actually call this one notes equal to get notes. Then we're going to try and find the target note which the user is trying to update. So we can say const target note equal to, then say notes.filter. So the filter method on arrays allows you to provide a criteria to filter out your array. We actually want to look through every single note and find the note which matches the ID which we're going to want to update. So inside here, we can grab onto each note and we can actually test. We can say if the note.id is equal to the ID which you're trying to pass in, then we're good to go. Then I can just say it index 0. So this right here, like I just said, it's filtering out to only provide notes with the same ID as the one you pass in, of course. This right here is always going to give you an array of a single element. With that array of a single element, we're then just saying an index 0 to get the first element, of course, referring to our note. Okay, so we can now say target notes dot content is equal to the new content which we're going to be passing through. Then we simply resave that array once again. So we'll say save notes, then pass through the notes array. So I hope that made sense, especially this filter part. If it didn't, I've got a whole video dedicated to the filter method if you want to check it out. So going back inside the browser, I can now do something like update a note. I can say something like we are almost done. I can now click away, and if I refresh the page, it's going to persist that change right there. So lastly, we can work on the delete note function. This one here is going to work once again in a similar fashion to the update and the add note. So for this, we can say const notes equal to get notes. Then we'll just say inside here directly dot filter. So we're going to use the filter method. Well, once again, this time we're going to only want the notes which don't have the same ID as we're passing in. So for this, we can say notes, then just say notes.id does not equal the ID which you pass in. So now, like I said, we're only going to see notes here that do not have the ID which we're passing in, of course, giving us every note but the target one. We can now just say save notes, then pass through the notes which we're trying to resave, of course, all of our existing notes. Then we can just say notes container dot remove child, and then we can pass through the element right there. This, of course, is going to physically remove your note or text area from the page. So now if I save this and go back in the browser, we are done with the sticky notes application, which means I can double click to delete all of the existing empty notes right down here. And if I was to now refresh the page, it's going to persist that change right there. So now we are done with the sticky note application. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.